Hi all, welcome back to the neighborhood. Today we're taking a look at the Matrix Audio Mini iPro 3, in for review thanks to Atmos Audio. I have an affiliate link with Atmos, so if you're thinking about picking up a Mini iPro 3 or anything else that they sell, try to make sure that you use my affiliate links before you do so. It really helps the channel with all its numerous costs and helps me to deliver quality reviews like this one to you. Alternatively, you can support the channel fiscally on Patreon. There's only one tier for $1.50 a month, and it gets you access to scripts for these reviews first. But hey, I really appreciate all my subscribers, so thanks everyone for all of your support. Anyways, back to the Mini iPro 3. Is it worth its rather large price tag at just over $1,000? Let's get into it. So the Mini iPro 3 by Matrix Audio is expensive, but in its defense, it's built pretty well and has a lot of thoughtful features in consideration of the user who will make such a purchase. First off, it's constructed of a solid metal chassis that does get somewhat warm to the touch with extended use. At 9 inches wide, 2 inches high, and 7.5 inches deep, it's not the largest box, but they certainly included a number of inputs and outputs for its size. Input-wise, there's a coaxial input, an optical input, a 2S LVDS input, a USB-C input, Bluetooth, Ethernet, and it has Wi-Fi capability. The latter two of which are important when using the Mini as a streamer, such as with Roon. Did I mention that the Mini is Roon capable and Roon certified? There's also an unbalanced RCA input for this device if you wish to bypass the DAC. Output-wise, there's an unbalanced RCA and a balanced dual 3-pin XLR output from the back of the device, and a 4.4mm and 1/4-inch headphone output from the front of the device. The front of the device also has a black aluminum volume knob which appears to be digitally stepped. But the star of the show is a 3.3 24-bit color LCD display, which displays the device settings, track information, and even has an image of the album. The screen on the front was a joy to use, and it may sound somewhat simple, but it actually brought a smile to my face to see album covers pop up on my favorite tracks. While I wasn't in love with the touch and feel of the volume wheel here, unlike the Burson Playmate 2, which I also recently reviewed, one can bypass the preamp on this device using the I button on the back of the unit to access an additional menu and toggle the line out mode between fixed and variable. However, the I button is awkwardly placed, and it would have been nice to be able to access the menu with the remote, but unfortunately this was not possible. Speaking of which, the unit also comes with a remote which lets you power the device off and on, send it to standby mode, toggle between inputs, raise, lower, or mute the volume, or toggle between the DAC's various equalization filters. Unfortunately, the range of the remote is rather limited to about 10 feet or so, and there seems to be no way to turn off the equalization filters, or at least no way that I could discover, as I could only select between them instead. I'm not sure if this is a function of the Matrix implementation of the ES903 8Q2M chipset that the DAC utilizes, or something else. Speaking of the chipset, it's capable of DSD512, PCM 768 kHz, 24 bits over USB, and 32 bits over 2S LVDS. So the sound of this thing was actually somewhat variable, sounding surprisingly different between its headphone amp and its DAC output. And let me go ahead and say to start with that the DAC of this thing performs solidly as a source in most cases, supplying a great analog sounding signal and showing excellent synergy with a variety of headphone and speaker amps alike. But while I generally enjoyed the performance of the Mini's DAC portion of this device, the Mini's headphone amp was not as consistently pleasing in conjunction with all of the headphones I tested. So let's start by talking about the sound of the headphone amp first, and then circle back a bit to the DAC's output performance itself by focusing on how it sounds with a variety of speakers. So I'm not really going to sugarcoat it here. In most cases, I found the headphone output to underperform for the price of this thing. In a number of cases, there was a less than desirable glare, a certain brittle thinness, and mild forwardness and harshness, especially in the upper mid-range specifically. Dynamic headphones like the HD66X and the HD560S from Sennheiser accentuated these shortcomings. Headphones like the Sennheiser 58X and Beyerdynamic DT177X Go, however, were better, but somewhat muddy on the low end and grainy throughout. Other headphones like the HiFiMan HE4XX and eMutiques felt flat, sterile, and uncharacteristically unemotional. There was also not enough power to handle my 600 ohm DT880 special editions, and these came across as muted, thin, and ghost-like. One way to frame this unit's dichotomy would be to say that the headphone amp sounded most like other Sabre chips that I've heard, with tendencies towards some glare here or there and an overly forward character at times. While the DAC output generally did not sound that way, sounding politely rounded and analog in contrast. For example, in testing the Meze Empyrean with either headphone output, either the balanced or unbalanced, the sound wasn't bad per se, but it was pretty lackluster compared to what these cans are capable of. Yet, in using the Mini i3 Pro as a pure balanced line-out to the THX AAA 789 to power the very same headphones, they became much more live and engaging. But I will also note that the 789 was a pretty great match for the Mini's presentation in general. Still, other cans sounded pretty good off the internal amp itself, such as with the HiFiMan Diva, the Mr. Speakers Ether CX, the Dan Clark Audio Aeon Open X, and even the notoriously hard to drive Argon's Mark II. But, in the case of all of these planar magnetic headphones, the headphone amp itself was driven to the top end of its capacity, even in balanced operation, being pushed to around negative 15 dB or even closer towards the top output of 0 dB. Even the notoriously easy to drive eMutique had to be driven around negative 30 dB in single-ended operation to produce sufficient sound. So this is not really a powerful unit as a headphone amp itself. Still, I did adore the performance of the Matrix with the HiFiMan Ananda. The Ananda has a slightly early mid-range reduction, which the Sabre and the Mini i3 Pro seem to compensate for quite well, in fact. The Ananda was also easily driven off the 4.4mm balanced output, and was a good tonal match for the Matrix as it smoothed over a number of its deficiencies. To summarize its performance with headphones, specifically as an all-in-one amplifier, it struggled with dynamics more so than it did with planars, but seemed to lack power and headroom in general, producing varied levels of synergy with a variety of devices, ranging from poor to mediocre, from lackluster to good enough, but still often lacked a special defining character as a headphone amplifier overall. So I wouldn't expect this to be a one-stop shop, for most headphones at least. On the other hand, it did perform more consistently with in-ear monitors, as these were seemingly less influenced by confounds from the amplifier section of the Matrix itself. For instance, although I did get some mild background noise from both the balanced and unbalanced outputs for more sensitive IEMs, such as with the ZSX and the new Tin Hi-Fi T5, this noise was not observable when music was playing, and each of these earphones sounded great off the Matrix in the end. For example, the bass on the T5 is where that IEM excels over its predecessors, and the Mini i3 Pro delivered one of the best low-end thumps with the T5 that I've heard yet in my testing of that earphone. Interestingly, the T5 tends to be a bit more forward on certain areas of its presentation on most sources. But uniquely, the presentation with the Mini i3 Pro was nice and even in comparison to these other sources. The new K-Bear Neon sounded full and uniform with the Matrix too, and was well distributed throughout its frequency response range, even for its single BA. At the time of this review, I was also lucky enough to have 2 prototypes for Blonde's upcoming IEM, the Prometheus, or now known as the A8, into the channel for review as well. The black variant of this IEM was likely the most detailed and technically proficient IEM that Blonde has produced to date, and I know that they went with this variant for mass production. Nevertheless, it sounded phenomenal when ran off the Mini i3 Pro, yielding excellent results for detailing, tonality, and peripheral imaging. So despite not having a 3.5mm or 2.5mm output to make IEM use easier, I did find the Matrix to be more reliable with IEMs than it was with headphones. With speakers, the presentation was slightly airy, mildly dry, moderately cool, and with a delicately soft, rounded edge to its notes. Furthermore, note weight was somewhat lean, but note separation was well defined. To my ears, the overall presentation almost had a DSD flavor to it. The best general description that I could come up with for the sound of the Matrix Mini i3 Pro would be polite but analog. Across speakers that I tested, the low-end presentation was rather tight, well controlled, and quick to resolve. Global transients seemed to resolve almost too quickly, and this was most notable in low regions of the frequency response. For example, sub-bass presentation was sufficient in terms of extension, but the sub-bass in general was less forward and seemed to short itself up rather hurriedly. Nevertheless, the DAC output itself was soothing to the ear, pleasant overall, and the farthest thing from harsh. In the course of my testing, I did notice that the balanced output was ever so slightly more resolving and detailed in contrast to the unbalanced output. But the unbalanced output at least kept up with other single-ended DACs which I had in for comparison and review, such as the iDSD Signature from iFi Audio and the Burson Playmate 2. In regards to speakers, I first tested the Mini in my main 2-channel setup using its balanced DAC and preamp feeding a Gold Note PA10 in low dampening mode hooked up to a set of Gershman Acoustic Studio 2 bookshelves. Next, the Mini spent some time in my home theater setup as an unbalanced line out with my set of vintage teal CS 1.2 tower speakers driven in stereo by my Onkyo TX RZ900, assisted by an HSU VTF2 Mark V and a Definitive Technology Supercube 1. And lastly, I took a seat with the Mini at my desk in an open near-field listening environment with a very special set of Cesaro Mini Wagners, provided to the channel by Gestalt Audio Design and assisted by a Supercube 2 and amplified by a PS Audio Sprout 100. With my Gershman acoustics, the presentation was notably tight, but also well-rounded and enjoyable for most music. If anything was lacking, it was some lower sub-bass distribution, which I referenced earlier and was consistent across all my testing of the Mini i3 Pro globally. Even with the assistance of my SU and DefTech Supercube subwoofers, my Teal's low end was notably withdrawn somewhat from what I've come to expect in that system. The Teals also revealed some mild thinness to note weights with the Matrix. Still, the general presentation was otherwise proper and soothing to my ears. Yet, the Matrix surprised me the most in near-field use with the Cesaro Mini Wagners at my desk. Without giving too much away about these Cesaros, as I have yet to give them a full review themselves, let's just say that the Mini Wagners have a healthy dose of treble, and I initially half expected the Mini i3 Pro that it might be a bit too thin in its distribution of sound, or perhaps overly accentuate the already airy speaker. But in the end, it actually took to the Mini Wagners quite well. The mildly restricted top end of the Matrix impacted the horn of the Mini Wagners just enough to ensure the Matrix polite presentation, and the speedy resolve of the low end of the Matrix was less noticeable in a near-field environment. Rather than being overly airy, the Mini Wagners took on a pleasantly raspy quality that I especially enjoyed with vocals. The mid-hump from the Matrix Saber chip was also pushed forward with the mid-range presentation with the speaker just enough to enhance blending in an otherwise lively speaker itself. So in summary, the Matrix Mini i3 Pro DAC amp combination unit is generally a better DAC than it is an amp, at least where headphones are concerned. While the headphone amp component did work well with most IEMs and some headphones, it could not be universally applied to produce great sound in my testing across the board. It not only lacked power, even in balanced operation, but was also rather picky with the headphones that I used to evaluate it with. For example, it did not drive the Meze Empyrean well without assistance from the THX AAA 789, but was a synergistic match for the HiFi Man Ananda. It was also a good match for the Cesaro Mini Wagner speakers at my desk in a near-field listening environment, and was surprisingly well controlled with this speaker. On one hand, this matrix appears to be made for near-field listening. The screen is too small to be viewed for enjoyment at a distance, the range of the remote was rather limited, and it was overly tidy with its transient reproduction, showing less of an influence of this at a near-field listening environment. On the other hand, I'd also be hard-pressed to think of a better pure DAC for the Matrix at its price, especially in balanced operation, as with balanced operation this thing took a step beyond its single-ended performance. The Mini isn't really well extended in either direction, nor is its transient reproduction as natural sounding as an RME ADI2, but it's also more polite and universally more pleasing across setups in my experience between these two DACs, producing a somewhat different sound, but also a nice analog feel. Additionally, the ADI2 also does not come with all the additional functionality and versatility that this thing possesses, such as an Ethernet and other streaming capabilities, Roon certification, an LCD display, a balanced headphone output, MQA decoding, and other features that the Matrix Mini i Pro incorporates, which are sure to be attractive to the right buyer. So while the headphone amp component of the Matrix may not justify its price, its DAC and streamer functionality sure does. The overall sound is unmistakably Sabre, but it's also uniquely analog, especially as a pure DAC. It is slightly airy with a speedy transient reproduction and a polite and pleasing presentation overall, which is sure to appeal to many as a value at its price point, given not only its sound, but also its versatility. And thanks again to Apos Audio for providing the Matrix to the channel for review. Also, make sure to check me out on Instagram, Twitter, the blog, on Discord, or become a Patreon. The Patreon is only $1.50 a month, and it gets you early access to written reviews like this one from me. And with that, I'm out for now.